recorded. There we are. And we're back with Andrea. We're so happy to have Andrea back with us this afternoon.
Hello, everybody. We're going to be talking about developing and practicing decoding in English for English learners, remotely or in person. And this is going to be for this session, it's going to be pretty straightforward. I am going to be presenting using PowerPoint slides just because of the sheer size of the slides. But same as yesterday, if you would like to access the slides, they are uploaded onto Google Drive, and so you can download them there. It's just a big file, so you'll have to download it instead of being able to open it in Google Slides. But there's that link if you would like to have the slides available to you afterwards. So always make sure I share that. And same thing as before, just feel free to use the chat, feel free to keep your camera on. If you have any questions, you can pop something in the chat, you can unmute yourself. We can figure it out as we go and interact however people are the most comfortable with. So don't hesitate to unmute yourself if you want to share an idea or if you have a question, or feel free to use the chat. I usually just leave the chat open so I can keep an eye on it as we're going through and answer questions as they arise. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at the whole approach to teaching phonics, which I know some people here are probably familiar with, especially if you've taken webinars with me or sessions with me in the past. This is one of my favorite topics for when it comes to teaching reading, teaching phonics, and coincidentally, what we're going to be talking about next, which is teaching writing. So we're going to look at some different options for student-generated texts that can be created virtually as well as in person. And then we'll be trying out a variety of different phonics activities. And I also wanted to let people know that I will be sharing, and I'm going to put this in the chat for you. So here is a handout of different activities that can be done remotely. And there are reading activities, writing activities, and then a couple pages of different phonics activities. How you can do them one-to-one over the phone, over a video call, or in a small group of Zoom or Google Meet. So if that's something that people are interested in digging into some different activity ideas, I wanted to let you know that those are available for you to check out as well. So that link is also in the chat. So to start out, what are we talking about when we are talking about phonics? What about phonics? So when somebody comes across a word that they're unfamiliar with, phonics is when we say, okay, can you sound it out? So in order to sound out a word, people need to be able to do three things. Number one is know and be able to produce the sounds the letters represent. So we have the letter C, that means k. Then we need to blend those individual sounds as we hear them in sequence. So we have our C-A-T, we can say k, at, at, cat. So blend those sounds together. And then the final step is to be able to recognize the word cat. Oh, I know what that word means. I have a mental image of cat. So when we come to sounding out a word, it's not just one skill that people are using. There's actually three different skills that people are using. However, oftentimes when it comes to phonics, what gets focused on the most is number one, be able to know and produce the sounds that the letters represent. And number two and three, which are equally as important, can often get kind of set off to the side. So what we're going to be talking about today is, how do we practice that know and produce the sounds letters represent, but also how do we do that blending? And then we cannot forget the importance of oral vocabulary development, because in order for people to recognize a word, they will have to be able to say it out loud, hear it, and then have it in their internal lexicon, have it in their internal vocabulary. So here are some just basic phonics teaching suggestions to get us kicked off. First off is try a variety of different activities. Don't just do the same one over and over. Try to do ones that are listening phonics activities, writing phonics activities, visual, hands-on. Also work on balanced instruction. Phonics is really important, but it can't be all that learners do. There has to be a lot of other things that people are working on as well. And doing a class an hour long on just phonics, it's exhausting, and it's not building up that vocabulary, that oral vocabulary that learners need. So yes, we should be working on phonics, but we should also be working on listening. We should be working on speaking, and then on kind of that whole text reading and writing as well. It can't all be just drilling down into phonics. And then, but the third recommendation is use whole, part, whole instruction. And this is what we're going to spend time talking about today. So whole means we start with a meaningful context. And then part, we're going to use words from the context to focus on phonemic awareness and phonics. And then we're going to go back to the whole, and we're going to return to meaningful context. So for example, our whole might be a clothing unit. We're talking about items of clothing. So our part is going to be the sh sound practice. So doing sorting activities and dictation with words like shoe, shop, shirt, wash, cash, those words that have that target sound in them. And then we're going to go back to the whole, where we're going to read a story about shopping for clothes, and we're going to write sentences with sh words. So again, you have that kind of whole big idea. You're going to do the part, which is those individual phonics practice sections, and then go back to the whole. So we're going to start by taking a look at whole when we are working on whole, part, whole phonics instruction. And a great way to do this, hold on just one second. All right. Sorry about that. I just got a tickle in my throat. So doing student-generated text, and a great way to do this is through a technique called the language experience approach. So the language experience approach, or LEA, has some pretty big advantages for learners. Number one is it tends to be highly relevant. And if you were in my session yesterday, we talked a lot about the importance of having relevant materials that capture interest. And I'm now going to pop a cough drop into my mouth, so hopefully I won't cough through this entire presentation. So thank you for your patience. When we do LEA, communication skills, including reading, writing, listening, and speaking, are going to be integrated. And we're going to be focusing particularly today on those reading skills and drilling down into the phonics. We can also adjust the difficulty of the vocabulary and grammar based on the learner's own language use. So using LEA can actually save a lot of time because you're not going to be out there spending hours searching for the perfect text. You're going to be creating it together with learners based on the language that they already use. And language and teaching, learning and teaching are personalized, they're communicative, and they can be very creative. And then finally, they tend to be very highly motivating to learners. So what are some different examples of types of LEA texts? We can do a personal story, a shared experience. Somebody yesterday mentioned taking community excursions. That would be a great example of a shared experience. We can look at picture stories, where we have a series of pictures that tell a narrative, or responding to a single picture or a photo. And even creating very simple sentence frames. So if we want to use LEA text with a personal story, for example, we can start with asking questions about a past experience with a relevant topic, like your favorite holiday or work or family. We can use really simple sentence starters for beginning level learners, things like I like or I have. If we wanted to do a shared experience, something that everybody tries out together, and this is one of those, in person, you might do a field trip, you might bring something into the classroom for people to share, make creating a fruit salad together, or doing a little tour of the school, or going and walking someplace in the community. When you are teaching remotely, you can do the same thing, and people don't even have to leave their houses. If you are teaching, you could be teaching on Zoom and take your phone and be somewhere and do a little tour. You could make a video and send it to people. You could have people doing cooking demonstrations in their own kitchen. Like, there's so many shared experiences that you can have when you are teaching remotely. So you'll want to choose the experience and organize the activity, make a plan and share it so learners know what's going to happen. Then you're going to conduct the activity. And again, it could be things like making food or doing a class project, having a guest speaker come in. And another thing that has been, now that we're all Zooming or meeting, has been so much easier to have guest speakers come in and pop in for a while. And I think this is something that we're seeing even as we go back to in person. A lot of teachers are continuing to plan to continue to incorporate that, being able to pop up a Zoom meeting and then have somebody come into the classroom via Zoom and talk to the learners instead of having someone physically come into the building, or doing a tour of a location. And then you're going to discuss and write about the experience together. So the learners give the words and the teacher writes them down, and those become the text. Okay. So we are going to hear from a teacher at Literacy Minnesota who works with a student who has been doing these types of stories with the learner that she has been working with. All right.
Hello, my name is Marion, and I'm a volunteer at the Northside Open Door program of Literacy Minnesota. Over the past months, pre-COVID, I was working as a volunteer teaching a small group of pre-literate students and helping out in a beginner level class. In that class, I was assigned to sit next to an older, dignified Oromo man named Haicho, and it was clear when we were in class that he was parroting and he had certainly was interested, but he was not reading and not really understanding what was being said. Well, then everything came to a screeching halt when COVID hit us all. North had to close, and our director Lloyd came up with the idea that we could do some individual tutoring and asked me if I would work with Haicho again. So he and I got some training, and I got from Minnesota Literacy. I also got to shadow someone for a little while they helped me kind of figure out how to do things online. And we worked on WhatsApp on our telephones. And it turned out that Haicho knows a lot more about WhatsApp than I do, because that's how he communicates with his family back in Ethiopia. for a few months we worked on that small screen, but he was having trouble hearing, and really had to look at this tiny screen to try to read the stories that we were reading and the letters we were working on. And finally he got access to a computer. So now we work on Zoom, and that's great because he hears well and he has a nice big screen to read from. Well, since we've been working together, he lives with his adult children and grandchildren, doesn't go out to work or do shopping. So I write stories for him that relate to his life and use the easy words that are the key words he needs to learn. And he is doing incredibly. He is now really reading. He can read most of the early keywords and can sort of slowly work through words that have a lot of syllables. I don't know that he comprehends them. So I found online an Oromo phrase app and also an Oromo dictionary. And so now I've got English words and Oromo words. He doesn't know how to read Oromo. He didn't go to school when he was young. So he reads the English words, then he reads the Oromo words, and then he recognizes the words he knows, which is really fun and exciting. And then he gets what we're trying to get across as he's learning English. So we're really having a good time together, and we've decided that we're going to be each other's teachers. So he is my Oromo Bashisha. Isn't that a beautiful word? Bashisha. It means teacher. And I am his English teacher. And we actually have a good laugh a lot of the time when I have just as much of a challenge learning the Oromo as he has learning the English. But the truth is, he has made incredible progress in these months, because I can spend two days a week, I spend an hour with him, and he always wants to go longer than we can, but I have to go to work. And so he's making great progress, and we've established a really fun relationship, and I've even had a chance to meet a couple of his adult children who have gone through the same Minnesota literacy program and are bilingual. So it's really a great experience.
I'm Sally, and I used to volunteer as a teacher at the Open Door Learning Center.
All right. So had a chance to hear from Marion talking about how she is using the LEA, doing her one-on-one, and how engaging it is for the learner that she works with, because it's extremely relevant to him. And also, I really appreciate how she talks about, she was somebody I consulted with at the beginning, and she's like, I feel like he doesn't really understand what's happening with phonics. So we came up together with the idea of, well, let's do it in Oromo and in English. And she's just been so excited about what a difference that has made. So that is something that I had never been able to recommend trying before, because usually people would be working with a class with multiple languages. But when people are working one-on-one, being able to bring in some phonics work from a learner's first language has made a huge difference. So if that is something that you are able to do, we are starting to finally have like some hands-on experience from tutors who are working with learners, that can really help make that connection for people who might be struggling to understand how exactly phonics works. So I also wanted to share an example, some different examples. We heard from Marion how she uses it, where she listens to him talk about his family, talk about his life, and then she writes stories. Here is an example of a personal story that I wrote when I had a class, and I had a learner who had been missing class, had missed class for about a week, and she came back and it's like, oh, where have you been? You know, what's been happening? And she told me this fantastic story about her sister having a baby in the bathtub. And as she was telling me the story, and it was a group of learners who primarily spoke Karen and spoke Burmese. And so she was telling me the story, and she would tell it in Burmese, and the rest of the class was kind of chiming in, and they were figuring out together how to tell me the story. And after we told the story, I wrote it down, And then this was the text we used for the rest of the week. We were very conveniently doing a health unit. And so a lot of the words that she was using, like ambulance, giving birth, healthy, I mean, those were words that we were currently working on in the unit. So I wrote it down. We used this as a story text for the week. And the learner who told me the story, whose story it was I've never seen somebody learn to read a story so quickly. Like, it was her story. She had lived it. And so she was not one of the higher learners in my class, but she was the first learner who was able to pick up the story and read it independently because it was so personal to her. And everybody else in the class was really interested and invested because they'd also kind of helped to tell that story. And then I wanted to show an example of a story that I created last summer when I was doing remote tutoring over WhatsApp with some literacy level Somali learners, where I took a series of pictures while my husband was cooking dinner. And then I showed the learners the pictures and we talked about what happened, and then wrote down the story. So he cooked dinner. There was spices and garlic, and onion and peppers, mushrooms, cooking vegetables, cans of tomatoes, beef, and then cooking the noodles. And like any good story, it has a happy ending, that I was happy because I like pasta. So this was a story that we created. I sent the photos over WhatsApp. The learners and I looked at them together. We talked about what happened, and they helped me write out the sentences. And we put them together. I put them together into a PowerPoint and then sent them to the learners so that they could read and listen ahead of time. So when teaching remotely, these were some of the different things that we were able to do. If you have Zoom, you can use to share your screen. At this point, I was teaching on WhatsApp, and so I would hold my phone and face it at the computer. It was like a document projector, and then the learner and I would practice reading together and then do our phonics activities based on the words in the story. So, kind of our first pause for a chat. I would love to hear, for when you are teaching, what kind of text, where do you find texts for when you are teaching remotely? So we just looked at some different examples of how you can create your own texts. But does anybody have any favorite places where you find, or different methods that you use to create your own texts? And this can be for teaching remotely, but then also for when you are back in person. So if you have any ideas, feel free to unmute or go ahead and pop things in the chat. All right, so a short video clip. You can show a video and then you can write a story about it. I love Bow Valley. I wish we had more Bow Valley literacy readers. Those are so fantastic. Anything else that people have found or used or really like? Great, a relatable photo. ReadWorks, good stories on different levels. You can go pretty low level on ReadWorks. Not quite literacy level, but you can go quite low on ReadWorks, and that they have those kind of nonfiction stories around science and stuff is great. And I just, the silver linings of everything I have really appreciated over the years. I've been teaching for a long time, and I remember the first few years I taught, If I wanted to use a photo, I would literally spend hours flipping through magazines, donated magazines, trying to locate photos to use for class. And now I can still flip through hours if I want to, but having so many options for finding pictures online, and how much easier it is to find pictures online, and how much easier it is, like Laura said, to find pictures online that are relatable, with people in the pictures that come from similar backgrounds as learners or have similar lives as our learners, as opposed to just what you see in a magazine.
We did 2 things on Zoom, the shared writing. One was a lot of our students were from different towns. All of our students were from different towns. To put a South Dakota map with and put pins on all of our towns, and then the people from those towns got to tell us something about their, this student and this student live in Vermilion. In Vermilion, we have USD, or something, a couple simple sentences, and then another shared story. Just like we had to write about our classroom, but we don't have a classroom. So they all had to tell me what they see in their learning environment. Like in my, where I am learning, I have a kitchen table, or I am learning on the couch, whatever. So those were 2 that I remember from this year.
Those are fantastic. Great. I love the idea of having a map with and being able to put pins and have people talk and write, and then people can go back, you can go back and read it. You have kind of a history of the class. Anybody else? All right. Well, let's look at part. So part is where, we have our whole story, and that whole story can be ReadWorks. It can be a photo that you've written sentences about, and they might be very simple sentences depending on your level. Like, I see 2 women. I see a pink dress. It might be using Bow Valley. Or maybe you've watched a video clip, and then you've written out what happened in the video clip. So you have your whole text. Now we're going to talk about the part of the text and how you practice the phonics and work on the decoding skills. So one of the things that I really recommend when it comes to teaching phonics is letting the story guide the phonics instead of letting the phonics guide the story or guide the text. Because we've all probably had that where you've, okay, well, we're going to work on these different sounds. And so I have to write a story that uses only these sounds, or you spend hours looking for the story that uses those specific sounds, and it ends up feeling really contrived. It's not necessarily something that's particularly interesting to the learners. It's just using targeted sounds. So if you are doing kind of the opposite, where you let the text set the phonics, and what that means is you're able to use authentic, engaging, or learner-created texts, and then you pull out the patterns and kind of highlight the different phonics that arises naturally from the text. So for example, we have the story from the learner. So we can look through this. We can say, okay, the B sound shows up a lot in it. So that is repeated. Also, we have the S sound shows up a lot. And here are several different examples of the long E sound, spelled as a double E or as a Y following a consonant at the end of a word. So we're going to practice our phonics. We're going to focus on the B, the S, and the long E sound and those patterns, and practice decoding the words that have those specific sounds in them and looking at those spelling patterns. So again, letting the text drive the phonics instead of vice versa, where the phonics is driving the text. So again, some examples of if you're teaching remotely, if you're teaching online, this might be where you have the your main text, like this is, I was doing a lesson, we were working on clothes, and we were working on the S and the sh sounds. So I was pulling clothes out of my closet and modeling them, and the learner would say the word and spell it for me and say whether or not it had the s or the sh. And then we were sending text messages back and forth with those. So some different phonemic awareness tasks that we can do that will help with decoding, that we can practice pulling out those sounds and words from the text. So the first one is categorization. Which word does not belong? Which word does not belong? Address, hospital, ambulance. Address, hospital, ambulance. And so for this, people can put in the chat. We can have people unmute, or to make it even more simple, you can number them and then have people just hold up 1, 2, or 3. Which one doesn't belong? Number 2. Starts with a h instead of an a, or it ends with a l instead of a s. We can also do words, things with phoneme deletion, where what is boy without the b sound? How do you say boy without the b sound? Oi. So you have people practice taking away a sound. So phoneme categorization, we're going to try this, and we're going to try this with Telugu words, which is a dialect from India. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read 3 of these Telugu words out loud. 2 of the words are going to start with the same sound, and 1 of them is going to start with a different sound. So you can either unmute or put in the chat which word is different. Which word begins with a different sound? Okay, so we have ama, ankalu, manta. Ama, ankalu, manta. Yes, manta. Next one, akali, ala, avu. Akali, ala, avu. Akali, ala, avu. Which one is different? All right. So, and Debbie just held up 2. So you can, that's a perfect example of how you can have people instead of type, because sometimes that might be beyond where learners are at right then. You can have people, if they have their cameras on, just hold it up. Yeah, so we had akali, ala, avu. So number 2, ala, with the short ah sound, is the different one. We can also do phoneme deletion, where you listen to the following words and then repeat each word without the beginning sound. So for this, we can do this as a different activities. We can do it as a verbal activity. We can also do it as a writing activity. So if I say avu, avu, what's the word if we take off the beginning sound? And I feel like I'm reading people's lips right now.
Voo.
Exactly. Or if I say matam, matam.
Atom.
Mhm. How about rabasa? Rabasa.
Abasa.
Perfect. Yeah. So you can do that as a verbal activity and then segue into doing it as a writing activity. So this is what that would look like. You have something where you copy 3 words, write the words again without the beginning sounds. So you are physically removing the beginning sounds. And this is incredibly helpful with decoding because it can get learners to be familiar with those patterns that we have with word families, where different words have the same spelling at the end and the same spelling pattern, and then we can change out the first words, their first letter, so that they can start to recognize those patterns. Also really helpful for that being able to, what we're going to talk about next, which is the segment and the pull apart. So other tasks that we can do for phonemic awareness that are going to help with decoding are being able to do words like rhyming. Do these 2 words rhyme? Had and mad. And you can have people say yes, say no, do a thumbs up, do a thumbs down. It doesn't even have to be verbal. So I'm going to show just a short video of doing a rhyming activity as a phonics writing activity in a classroom.
Another word that sounds like need. Another word. Where is it? Another word. Feed. Okay, where is feed? Is that feed? E-W. E-E-D. Same? It's the same?
Feed.
Is this the same as need? No. Okay. Where is feed? Feed.
Wheat.
Weed. Feed. Feed. Yes. Feed. Feed and need. The same? Same end? Same end? Are they the same? Same, yes. Okay, right. Feed. Yes. Very good. Good job. Feed. Yes, here it is. Let's put it up there. Yeah. Feed.
And I love in the video how you can see the learner that she's working with actually put his fingers down and he covers the first part, the first letter of both words when she's asking, are they the same? So he takes his fingers and he covers the first letter so he can just see the EED on both of them and then is like, yes, they're the same. So that's building up those decoding skills, being able to recognize those patterns that happen in word families. So then really, when you can start to get that automatically, what that means is you have that automaticity for recognizing the second part of the word. You really only need to be sounding out and decoding the first part of the word, which makes that whole process so much faster to do. And it makes just speeds reading up. So some other tasks are things like phoneme blending. And if you're wondering like, this is a lot, what should I really spend time on to help learners with decoding? Phoneme blending. So phoneme blending is so huge. So phoneme blending, doing it verbally would be saying something like, what word is e, l, f, e, e, l, f, e. And then having learners be able to say healthy. So putting it together. And this is critical because this is where what we were talking about way back at the beginning comes into play, where oftentimes a learner comes across a word and we say, they don't know the word, and we say, okay, sound it out. And so somebody sounds out the word. So they're able to sound it out, letter, kind of that letter by letter. And they get to the end and they still aren't able to read the word. Being able to say k, ah, t, doesn't help you read the word cat unless you're able to blend it together and k, at, cat, cat. So that phoneme blending, it's not just the individual sounds. We have to figure out how to blend them together so that when we say the word out loud, we can recognize it and actually read the word. So if there's one thing you're going to spend time on with phonics, I would say spend time on doing phoneme blending. Because if people they can sound out all the letters they want, but if they can't blend them together to a recognizable word, they're not able to actually read the word. So we can do that verbally and practice doing it verbally with the words from our story, where we sound it out and then have the learners blend it together into a word. And then the other task that I would really recommend doing is phoneme segmentation. And phoneme segmentation is the opposite of phoneme blending. Phoneme blending is putting words together. Phoneme segmentation is being able to pull words apart. And phoneme segmentation is crucial for being able to do any sort of spelling. Because if somebody wants to spell a word and they don't know how to spell it, what do teachers always say? We say, okay, sound it out. But learners who have, limited experience with phonics in their first language, this is really hard. A word is a word, like a word is a chunk. So that concept of like pulling the word apart and there being different phonemes that make up the word is actually really, really challenging and can be really abstract. So this is something if you want to work on decoding, people being able to hear a word and then write it down, phoneme segmentation is really crucial. So this would be things like, okay, how many sounds are in the word said? How many sounds are in said? S, e, d, s, e, d. There are 3 different sounds in said. And when I was teaching literacy level, we talked a lot about it's one word, it has 3 sounds, but 4 letters. And so then we were able to start recognizing that s, e, d, that sometimes 2 letters make one sound. And it's building up that ability to recognize those phonics and recognize those patterns that are going to make learners much more comfortable when they come across it when they're reading. So it's going to make decoding much easier. So one of the best activities for phoneme blending is to have people physically look and be able to touch. And if you are teaching remotely, you can always show things and then kind of demonstrate with a laser pointer. So if you're teaching remotely, I would recommend doing it this way. You can also have people write things down on their notebook and do it as well. If you're in person, index cards with it written on them also work really, really well. And then you can have people move their finger as they say the different sounds. So let's try this together, and I'll use my laser pointer. And if you want, you can even put your finger up towards the screen and follow along. So the first one is kra, 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 ha, Kra. Ha. So you start out slow and then you start to speed it up. Kra, ha, kra, ha, kraham, 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 kraham. So start out one by one, and then you practice blending it, literally moving your finger faster and faster as you blend the sounds together. Because this is a really good skill that people can be able to, as they're reading and decoding by themselves, it's a technique that they can use. You start slow, letter by letter, and then you gradually speed up and read it faster and faster until you're just reading the word. So you just learned how to say red in Khmer. That was the word red in Khmer. So if you are working with learners at home, maybe you're doing the same thing, but you're having them write in a notebook and then use their finger to follow along in the notebook as you're practicing decoding the words. And then the last activity I'm going to show you is phoneme segmentation. And so this is my favorite activity. I use it with beginning learners all the time, but I've used it up to fairly high level intermediate learners, because this is just a fantastic activity for having people be able to be more comfortable spelling. And I've had quite a few learners who are native Spanish speakers who are high level, who are like, this is really hard for me because I'm so used to my language, which is really phonetic. And English is a lot trickier to hear where the different sounds fall in it. So for this, you would have a beginning, middle, and end card. If you're teaching remotely, you can put something like this and then have people annotate, and should be able to annotate. We can annotate on shared content. If you're teaching in person, my favorite way to do this is, again, having an index card with the beginning, middle, and end, and then I'll give learners a marker like pennies, and they can put the pennies where they hear the sound. So for this, I could say, okay, where is the p sound in pencil? Where's the p sound in pencil? Can somebody show me can somebody annotate and mark on the screen? Right, so I see there's some dots on, there we go, on beginning. How about in lamp? Where's the p sound in lamp? Where's the p sound in lamp? Where's the p sound in paper? Where's the p sound in paper? So it shows up in the beginning and the middle of that word. And you can do this with a single word. So instead of coming up with a list that have the same sounds, instead I could say, let's say we have the word pen. I could say, okay, where's the n sound in pen? Where's the n sound? Great. Where's the p sound? Where's the eh sound? So you can take one word and you can kind of pull it apart and have people identify where the different sounds are. And this, again, it's that segmentation. It's that ability to think of a word not just as a whole complete unit, but as something that's made up of different sounds that we can listen to, identify, and pull apart to be able to decode and be able to write. So again, super simple activity. You can do it with kind of any word, any text, but really makes a tremendous difference in people's comfort and their ability to hear where sounds fall in a word, which makes them able to then spell. All right, so we talked about before that letting the text drive the phonics instead of letting the phonics drive the text. So here's a story that I wrote with my learners, where I took pictures of my husband cooking, and then we wrote a story together about it. So if you look at this story, take a look. What are some of the phonics patterns? What are some of the different sounds that you see showing up that you could highlight if you were doing some parts work with this story? So feel free to unmute or pop things in the chat. You can also, if you want, you can also annotate on it and just circle or underline things too. Yeah. All right, so I'm seeing the ED sound, ED endings. And that's fun because then we get into all sorts of pronunciation work with that. The double O in cooked, the P, S endings, noodles, vegetables, tomatoes, spices. The K sound. Absolutely. So we can take our text, we look at it, and we're like, all right, what are we going to pull out and focus on while we are practicing it? What words are we going to focus on and what sounds are we going to focus on? So some more part suggestions. We can always reread and copy, circle words or letters, match words or sentences to pictures, do a partner dictation, play vocabulary bingo, word search, or a sentence scramble with several sentences from the story. Oh, and a great question. How many sounds per text would you focus on? I generally do 3 to 4. But I wouldn't do more than that because then it just gets to be too overwhelming. And if I'm working with a really, really beginning class, it would probably be 1 or 2. But in general, 3 or 4 is sort of the rules, like what rises to the surface. Or sometimes even if there's only 1 or 2 examples of something, but we've did it the week before or we did it previously, I'll bring that back so we can do some more review of talking about the same sounds. So these part suggestions aren't all necessarily decoding, but they are helping learners work on building up that vocabulary as well, because that vocabulary is just as an important part of being able to sound out a word. And of that decoding process, it's having that working vocabulary so that once you sound out a word and say it out loud, you're able to understand it and you recognize it. So if we're teaching in person or remotely, we can do things like circle the picture where you say a word, and learners have to circle it. And you can also say things like, what words have the p sound? What words have the p sound? What word is g, a, l, I, k? And then learners have to circle that. So you can do lots of different phonics and vocabulary activities. You can do things like fill in the missing word or letter, again, in person. And if you're working remotely, you can use that annotate tool to have learners be actually writing on the screen and interacting with it. Same things with circle the words. If you're in person, learners can be circling on their own paper and building up that automaticity. And if you are teaching online, you can have learners circle using the annotate tool. Or if learners aren't able to annotate, they can also be saying things like sentence 3, second word, and be able to identify where where they find it, which is leading, like paving the pathway for being able to show evidence. Where did you find that answer? I found it in the third sentence, like here. So doing this kind of activity and have learners tell you where, like that's going to be paving the way for some of those higher level skills that are going to come down the road. And then you can do things like word search, which again, just it's building up that ability to identify and look for patterns. I wouldn't recommend doing word searches every day, but once in a while they're fun and they're actually really helpful for, again, being able to identify and practice patterns. And if learners can annotate, they can be a lot of fun to do via Zoom, where you have different learners in charge of finding different words and then circling it and showing where they are on the screen. So what other part activities do people have people used, or would people recommend? So what are those phonics or decoding, even vocabulary word identification activities that you've done remotely or that you love doing in person? So feel free to unmute or feel free to share in the chat.
This is not answering your question, but the word search, we have some word searches in our Burlington, in our curriculum. And in my advanced class, I make them tell me row 1, column 3, like they're learning words like row and column, first, third. So that's kind of fun to add in there when your students can do it.
That's fantastic. And I think like you could have pretty low level learners doing that. It's just a matter of introducing the vocabulary and then like reinforcing it. We're having people use it all the time.
I even do it with level 2, but
That's
I
great.
draw on the screen. I'll draw, say, oh, vertical lines go up and down. They're called columns, you know, and I'll say the rows, the ones that go side to side, or I draw it and label it. And then even level 2, oral level 2 students have been calling them rows and columns all year. So,
which is fantastic, because as soon as they get into doing higher level, any of the higher level reading where they're looking at graphs, they're going to have to be able to talk about and answer questions about which row, which column, how many. So that's fantastic, and like really laying the pathways for using some of those more academic words, even at a low level. Anybody else? Any other activities that you'd want to share? And again, feel free to pop in the chat or feel free to unmute.
Andrea, when you're talking about part activities, at the very lowest level, we do the substitution. So we might have the word family and they substitute the first letter. Or if we have words that have a vowel change, that I can say the word and then they can think about which vowel they just heard that would go in there. So we get it kind of like that. But that's just using those really small CVC words.
Yeah, and those CVC words, like they pop up a lot when you are, whether you're using prepared texts or whether you're doing kind of that create your own text, because there tend to be so common. So those are great activities. And that substituting out is building up that familiarity with word families, or I recognize the first and the in part of this word. So, oh, and I know how this sounds, so now I can say it.
Vowels seem to be the difficult.
Vowels, I've taught English for 20 years. I despise the vowels in English. Like, it's not fair. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
In pretty much every other phonetic language, vowels follow a very identifiable pattern. They don't in English. It's really not fair.
Yeah.
So, there's a reason why it's so tricky. Yeah. I still distinctly remember when I was first started teaching, and I had just taught the EA. When you see EA, it's going to sound like E. And we had a poster on the wall, and a learner pointed to the poster and said, "Earth." And I went, no. Like, yes, but no. That's what we call a sight word. You're going to just memorize that word. Great. So anybody else? All right. Well, if you have any other thoughts, pop them into the chat. And we are going to wrap up by looking back at the whole. So our idea is that we start with a whole text, a whole story, a big idea. We break it down. We do some part activities where we're practicing the phonics and the decoding. We're building the vocabulary, and then we move it back into the whole, so that we're not working on those phonics sounds in isolation and separated from the larger text. So if we're using a text, and with decoding, we're probably going to be using a text, we're going to move it back into the whole story. And this can be reading the story, reading it multiple ways, but there's also plenty of other activities that we can do that are kind of encompassing that whole picture. So things like, all right, now retell the story out loud. What do you remember in your own words? Asking comprehension questions and having learners cite evidence. And that can be something like, they answered the question, did she have a boy or a girl? She had a boy. I found that in sentence 11. We can complete a close of the story with or without a word bank. We can sequence sentences, so we have them out of order and then learners have to put them in order. If we're doing that remotely, we can have the sentences on a slide and learners can put the numbers. If we're doing it in person, we might physically cut the sentences apart and have learners physically order them. We can have learners do a group reading of the story or read the story to a partner, write a dialogue and act it out based on the story. What do you think the people said in the story? Have learners generate questions to ask each other based on the story, or create a story timeline. So all of these activities that we can continue to work with the text that are more of the big picture, looking at the story as a whole, as opposed to looking at the individual words and practicing the phonics with the words in the story.
Andrea, I have a question. And
go ahead.
You need to save it till the end of it. That's fine too. Here at Center for New Americans, we do our packets like a whole month in advance. I like the learner generated story, but how do I get the story to them without having them come back to me and pick up a paper, So we had discussed the idea of being proactive and thinking about the content for the month before, generating the story, but then they wouldn't get it until the month later. So is that an issue as far as using that story quickly after they've shared that story? Or
yeah, well, what you might want to do is things like, you could ask learners to all, if you have a way to communicate with learners, whether that's WhatsApp or Remind, you could send a picture and have learners send you back sentences about the picture. Or if you're able to, like on WhatsApp, it's really easy to send pictures. You could have learners send you different pictures about things that like things in their house, give them a theme, or, you know, their family or places in their neighborhood, and everybody could send you a picture, and then you can kind of assemble a story using the pictures that the learners have sent, and using those kind of formulaic sentence frames. Like in Blank's house, he or she has a,
Mhm.
so you can still, I think you can, there are still ways that you can get learner involvement
Okay.
in it, but it's going to, you know, if you're doing packets, it's just going to look a little bit different than when you are in person, or if you're doing the synchronous classes where you can have the back and forth. So it might be more like, send me a picture and I'll put the picture in the story using the sentence frame.
Okay. So having a lapse of time between generating the story and working on the story for phonics or whole reading is not a detriment.
I would say no, especially if it's something that's really engaging to learners. Like, and once you get that in the pattern, like next month, we're going to talk about this. Send me a picture of this.
Okay.
Like that's what you do. And then next week or next month, we'll incorporate it into our story.
We'll teach technology on how to send pictures.
I like Marian said in her video, and when I was working with a woman who was a great grandmother, and she was teaching me stuff on WhatsApp. Like we were on a phone call and she was sending me pictures of her great grandchild while we were on the video call. And I was like, wait, you can do that? How did you do that? So there's plenty of things that I was really kind of pleasantly surprised at just how much learners knew how to do if you're using the right technology, or someone in their house knows how to do it.
Got it.
And we'll help them with it.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. That was a great question. And super interesting to think about. I did a project in the Philippines this past year where the teachers were teaching over CB radio. And so it's just fascinating to hear how different programs, like around the United States and around the world, the creative ways that teachers are getting around remote tutoring and are making it work. So whatever you're doing, if learners are engaged in learning, fabulous. So any other whole activities that people could do with stories? Well, just like what we were talking about, you might have a story on a topic, and then you might ask learners to send you a picture, or send a narration. Like I'm a big fan of WhatsApp because it's so easy to record audio and video. And so learners could like show something and narrate it, something that's based on the story, or based on the theme. Anything else? Any other ideas that people have?
Sometimes I have the students retell the story using the visual prompt instead of the text, to continue to reinforce their oral mastery of the vocabulary.
I love that. Yep. So if you wrote a picture based on, and I think Laura, you'd shared the example of using a relevant picture. You write a story, you read it, and then retell the story, but don't read the text. Just look at the picture. Yeah. All right. Any other ideas? Well, if you have anything else, feel free to share or pop it in the chat. And then we just have about 2 minutes left, but if anybody has any number one takeaways or any other ideas that you want to share with the group, I'm just gonna open it up for the next 2 minutes. You can use the chat, or feel free to unmute.
I just wanted to thank you for the idea about number of sentence, number of word. we number the sentences, but having them pay attention to how many words are in the sentence will help with their reading skills as far as not dropping out some of those smaller words.
Yep. And because that's such a good point, because that's a good cue where if somebody reads a sentence and they're dropping words to be able to say, wait, how many words are in the sentence? Which makes them go back and kind of look word by word.
Yeah.
Mhm. The phoneme blending.
Mhm.
Mhm. Great. Anybody else?
Okay.
The 3 to 4 different parts.
Yeah.
I liked how you are encouraging us to keep it relevant to what they're doing. I found that very helpful, even when we have a holiday. Just talking about, I had some English students that I was trying to teach English to, and it was a holiday weekend, and I just said, what are you doing for fun this weekend? They didn't know the word fun. So it was just an opportunity to, number one, teach a word, but have some conversation to practice that conversational English of, because that's what people are going to ask them, you know, what did you do for fun this weekend? And got to teach them that. And so sometimes as a teacher, you can overthink it and say, oh, I'm just wasting their time with all this conversational stuff. But at the end, I appreciate that. It's like, okay, no, that does help them learn.
Yeah, and that's such a good example, Amy, because if they're reading and they come across the word FUN and you've never taught it to them, they're going to spell it. They might sound it out, they might blend it, but still aren't actually reading it because they don't know what it means. So, yep, like doing that casual conversation about people's lives is just such a great way to build up that vocabulary. So when they do come across the word, they'll recognize it. All right. Well, we are at time. So go ahead and end and give everybody a chance to stretch and move before we have our next one. And is there a drawing today?
There is a prize today. Okay. Laura Smith Hill is our winner.
Woohoo!
Congratulations, Laura. That's all I have. Go take your break.
Thank you.
Thank you.